All right, well, today we are back to work on the C6 competition drift car build. Man, it has been a while since I've said that. We have been so focused on the shop build and getting this place finished out and set up because this has been in the works for well over a year. We're finally to the point where we can start setting it up for good, so it was hard to resist. And as much as I want to keep going down that road and finishing this place out like we want it, there still is a lot to do to get it exactly how I've kind of planned it. But that being said, we have got it to the point of being a fully functional workspace. We've got 2 lifts, we got storage, we've got our parts organized, we've got tools, we've got worktops, we've got everything we need in here to continue building this car. So we might as well give it a trial run. The whole point of it is a workspace. See how it works. So that's what we're gonna be doing today. We're back to work on this thing, which I am very excited because despite it looking really far off, because we don't have any of the body panels on it, because it's way easier to work on without body panels, we are actually very, very, very close to the end of this thing. So much so that the plan for today's episode is to try to fire it off for the first time. So this is gonna be a big moment, always a scary moment. We do have a few things to tidy up before we can give it a shot, but as far as we know, we've got everything we need to get this thing buttoned up and kick the tires and light the fires, as they say, press the button and hope it goes well. So I'm gonna quit jibber jabbering and we're gonna get into it. So this right here is the final piece of the puzzle to get this thing fired up. This is what we have been waiting on, what has held us back just a little bit. So these are our dry sump lines. These are the ones that go from the tank to the pump. Now on the rest of the car, we did screw together fittings. However, on this section, we needed some very specific direct to ORB fittings to get us the amount of clearance we wanted, which only came in crimp, so we decided to do crimp fittings. However, we don't have a crimper, so we've been waiting for a good time, and finally, while we were down at the Freedom Factory, we went by Cletus's shop. James helped us get these things crimped up, and we're ready to put them back on the car, fill it with oil, prime the system, kick the tires, light the fires. So, however, I said we're ready. Before we do that, there are a couple tiny little odds and ends I want to do before we put these lines in. The first of which being, we need to get this tank off and plate up these holes. So we still got a couple holes left in the firewall that need to be sealed up, and once the tank's on, the lines are in, and it's full of oil, it's gonna be very difficult to do that. We're gonna have to drain it out, we're gonna make a mess. We might as well get it done now, as much as it pains me to not just slap this thing back together and press the button. So I'm gonna quit jibber jabber and we're gonna start taking this apart, making some plates, getting them put on, so on and so forth. You know the deal. Enough jibber jabber, let's get back to work. To work for the first time. This is the first time, so let's get to work. So with the cover plates finished up and finalized, we can fully reinstall the dry sump tank. Now, another thing we needed to do while it was off was shove this 4-inch ducting back behind it. There was no real way to fish it through with the tank in, but we were able to put it in and kind of squish the tank into place. Now, the purpose of this is to either draw cold air into the engine bay, force it in, or pull the hot air out. That way we have some airflow moving around in the engine bay. So with that all done, dry sump tank fixed, breather tank back on, it was time to reinstall the dry sump lines. Now, this is a pretty pivotal moment. These lines being crimped, we had to take them all the way down to the Freedom Factory. So we marked them, but if we crimped these, the orientation wrong at all, they weren't gonna fit. So it was extremely important that they all fit back correctly. If they didn't, we'd be pretty dead in the water. But fortunately they did, and I moved on to tidying up the battery cables. I just got some better terminals to better fit the posts that they were going to, just to make them a little tighter, a little nicer, just fix up the fit and finish a little bit. So with the dry sump lines back in, it was just full scale reassembly. We had pulled the header off just to make it easier to mark them before we pulled them out, because that caulking was so crucial, and if we got it wrong, they weren't gonna fit. So we wanted to make that easier on ourselves by pulling the header off. So now we can put it all back together as it was before. We got the header back on, we got the EGT probes back in, we need to get the alternator bracket and alternator back in, we need to get the serpentine belt back on. Again, this is just reassembly point. We had all this taken apart to pull the header and pull the lines. Now we can put it all back together, and it's a satisfying feeling when you're putting stuff back on that already fits, because it just goes together so much quicker. So another thing I needed to do was put a ground cable from the engine to the chassis. Engine to chassis grounds are very, very important. And I thought about doing it before I put the header on, but I forgot. So now I had to struggle with getting it on with the header on. But we got that in place. We finished up and terminated our starter power feed wire from the battery. It's completely separate from the ECU and PDM feed wire. It's very important to run them separately so they're not drawing each other down. And then I started working on some little things like my alternator power wire and making sure that was done and ready, just all the odds and ends. So one thing we do need, obviously, to start this thing is some fuel. Now we have some fuel lying around, but this thing needs to get the good stuff. So we picked up a barrel of the good stuff, got back to work finishing up those last few odds and ends, one of which being our coolant lines. They run under the header and over the downpipe, and we haven't had a good way to secure them. So I whipped up this quick, simple little plate to basically mount to the block and then zip tie the lines to, keep them nice and high and up out of harm's way. We don't want any lines touching or resting or that could move and rest on any of the hot stuff. We want to keep the cold stuff from the hot stuff. So we got all that squared away, and we're about ready to see if everything works. All right, well, we've got a lot of the odds and ends tidied up. I still need to throw on this alternator cable I just made down to the starter, but we've got the engine to chassis ground done. We got our blow-off valve vacuum line done, and we have just been crossing our T's and dotting our fittings, pun intended. So as we tighten everything, we've been putting dots just so we know what we tightened. Again, when you're building a car, you're taking things on and off constantly. Everything ends up being hand tight, and you don't know what's tight and what's not. So as we go through and check and tighten everything, we're dotting it so we know, hey, we checked that, we tightened it, we're good to go. So I'm gonna go through this probably another 2 times to try to check every last odd and end, but we are about ready to fire this thing up. The next real step is putting fluids in it. We need to put oil in it, get the oil system primed. We need to put gear oil in the transmission just because we don't have the clutch hydraulics hooked up yet. So we won't be able to, the trans is going to be free spinning, so we want to make sure it's lubricated. And most importantly, engine can't live without fuel. We need to put fuel in it. So I do have some Pump E from the Miata. That's what I've been running it on forever. But honestly, I don't want to run this car on Pump E. I want to run it on some Nice E. And since we've got a completely dry fuel system, we might as well start off strong, not have to try to flush some Pump E out of it. So we went with 1 ethanol. Real Street carries it, and they stock it, and they're local. I mean, they're literally essentially right down the street from us. It's a really, really solid quality fuel. It's from a local shop right here, which is awesome. Always try to support local if you can. And from what I've seen, people have had really good luck with it. So I'm excited to try it. I'm excited to run this thing on it, have it on a nice proper fuel. I'm sure it'll end up in everything else. We'll probably put it in the Zafiro because it's got flex. We'll probably put it in the Miata just to see. I'd like to see how much power it makes on pump versus that, especially being an NA setup. We'll probably end up using it on everything, but this was the main reason for taking that next step to a quality fuel. And I can't tell you how cool it feels to have a drum of race fuel sitting there. It's a big moment for me, as silly as it is. So anyway, I'm jibber jabbering. I am gonna finish up my last couple loose ends, and then we're gonna start putting fluids in it and get ready to start it. All right, we've got the oil tank filled as far as we can go. Now, that is nowhere near filling the entire system. We've got a lot of lines and things to fill. We have a belt, we have a pulley, we have a drill. We're gonna spin over the dry sump pump pulley, which you can see right there, and try to get oil all the way through the system back to the tank before we even consider firing this thing up. Now, luckily, one cool thing we have is we have this clear view filter housing. So I've seen these a lot in drag racing, not so much in drifting, but the cool thing about this is, that as the name implies, clear view, we'll be able to see at least when we get oil into here, and ideally when this is kind of fully primed. This is moment of truth number 1. We're gonna have a few of these moment of truths. This is, you know, it's gonna test all the lines, it's gonna test and make sure that the system's good, and that we don't have any massive leaks anywhere, so hopefully it goes smoothly. It's so sad to get rid of this nice cap. Yep. Not just yet. I'm gonna prime it again. I don't even know what the regulator's set at.
Plate leak
Where?
under the tranny.
Under the tranny. So we gotta pull the intake off. That sucks. Damn. So as we went to prime the fuel system, we found a leak in the worst possible spot at the junction behind the intake manifold. Now, it was really difficult to get to try to snug them up a little more. They weren't really loose. They did get a little tighter. The leak got a little less, but it was still dripping a little bit. So we pulled the intake off, we pulled the lines off. We were able to tighten them a little more at the junction, but we were still kind of concerned. It's a lot of work to take this intake on and off, and we didn't want to put it all the way back on just to have the issue and not really be able to get to it. It's just very, very difficult to get back there and check that. So what we decided to do was redo this part of our fuel system and make it to where that junction was something that we could service and access and get to easily, so that way we didn't put this thing all the way back together just to find out it's still leaking. You know, we had pressure tested the lines and they weren't fully holding pressure, so we were worried about it. We were concerned that it wasn't going to seal and we were going to be back in the same boat. We were going to have to take this thing all the way back apart. Now, pulling an intake might not seem like a big deal, and normally it's not, but of all the things that we made very serviceable on this car, this is just one part of it that is just not very serviceable. It is just kind of a pain. There's a lot of things that have to kind of go on as you're halfway putting the intake on. It has these really shallow O-ring glands that it's easy to pop the O-rings out if you try to slide the intake at all. It's just not a good time. It's probably the most dreaded job I could have to do on this car, aside from, you know, something really big like pulling the engine out or something. So as much as it was a tough pill to swallow, as we were right there at startup, to take the time to build 2 new lines, shorten another one, and redo all this stuff, we knew it was going to be worth it for the long run, and maybe even in the short term. Again, if those had leaked again, it would have taken us more time to mess with that again than it did to just remake the lines, make it a little bit simpler, and make it a little more foolproof for the future, and hopefully start this dang thing. All right, well, it is all back together, man. Of all the things to leak, it is ironic that those, I bet if you asked me and Josue independently, of all the lines to leak, which ones would you like to leak? Like, which ones do you not want to leak for sure? What are the worst ones? We would have said those ones, of course, out of all of them. But honestly, even though it made for a long night of not even getting to try to start the car, I think it worked out for the better. I'm much happier with this setup now after kind of messing with both. Having the Y down there is just a much better spot, and now we can completely access all fittings on the fuel system without having to take anything apart. Now, the reasoning for doing it the original way was to minimize having two big 10 AN lines having to go up through that tight gap around the bell housing and then up under the intake, as well as not having a big Y section with 3 fittings next to the transmission that could get in the way when we're taking the transmission in and out. It was a compromise. Building a car like this is all about compromises. There is no silver bullet solution for a lot of this. There is no, oh, I can put this here and I don't have to make any compromises elsewhere. There's always a compromise somewhere. And we decided to compromise on accessing the fuel lines and servicing them in exchange for better and more easily being able to service the transmission. But when it came down to it, we had a leaky fitting and we needed to tighten it up. It was nearly impossible, and that's not something we can have. If that happened at the track, man, it would be a nightmare, and it would be a very silly thing to get taken out by or not be able to fix in time because of where they're located and we can't get to it. But overall, I'm glad it happened. I'm glad we changed it. I think it's much better now. That being said, still got a couple things to do. Still need to tidy up the line routing underneath. Still got to tidy up a couple other little things, but Rowdy and Josue should be here soon. We're essentially back to where we started before we found the fuel leak, so hopefully we're gonna give it another shot. We had no oil leaks. Hopefully now we have no fuel leaks. And if that's the case, we're ready to start it. So enough jibber jabber. Wish us luck. All right, test number 1. I need to check the starter button parameters. Pressure? Yeah, it was climbing. Because the starter button latched on, which when you set up those buttons, you can set it to be momentary or latch. Yeah. I don't know if maybe, it says momentary. Yeah. All right, let's try it again.
Keep this on?
Yeah, it's fine. I feel like either something's going on there because the button's trying to stay on. I don't know if I'm losing. I need to watch this real quick. It might be shutting the ECU off. Let me see. Yeah. Yeah. I've had this happen before. This is what I was kind of worried about with where to put the starter power wire. Alright, it's a voltage issue for sure. Because the voltage for the fuel pumps was dropping down to like 9 as we were trying to crank it. We'll lift it up, we'll switch that power wire, like put it directly on the battery. So ECUs can be kind of finicky if they're getting a lot of draw from the starter. It'll take so much from the ECU that it'll shut off. So what I decided to do was add another battery. I had a mount that would fit this other battery that I had, same as the main one, and basically give the starter its own battery and try again. So at this point, we're sure something's wrong. I tried honestly more times than I should have. Usually if a car doesn't start or does backfires like that, it means something is wrong with your crank system, your ignition system as a whole. So we started pinning things out and looking through everything, the crank sensor, the cam sensor, making sure that all those were pinned correctly back to the ECU since we added this firewall bulkhead. And as we were looking through the coil pack harnesses, we noticed that they were backwards. Cylinder 1 was number 2 and cylinder 2 was number 1 and so on and so forth. That could definitely be our problem. All right, well, we found a smoking gun. So the coil pack lead wires to the coil pack sub harnesses were backwards. Now I based them off of usually these harnesses are meant to come out on the driver's side and come along here. So I put the longer side on this side, which is what I assumed it was, and it was not. So those are backwards. The cam sensor might have been.
The battery charger's still on.
Oh yeah. All right. gonna try to switch the crank sensor wires back the way they were. I was just getting a constant error. Yeah, let me try to switch them back again. Okay, ready?
But you called going back and flip-flopping it back, because that's what happens. You start chasing.
Yeah, so we had switched the cam sensor wires because on certain models they're different on Gen 3. I thought they were right the first time, but we switched them as a shot in the dark. So when it was spinning and sputting immediately, I was like, I feel like it's got to be something else. Or wait, I didn't kill switch. It fired right up. It's so quiet.
Yeah,
I was expecting it to be so loud.
It is pretty quiet.
Okay, so we still got to go back and do some things here. The intake's gonna have to come back off, which is a bummer, but it starts. Let's start it again, just for fun. Just because, why not? Ignition. No throttle this time.
Congrats, my friend.
That's so badass. It starts so good too. It's just like so good.
Whoa, we did it!
Good job, boy. Good job.
Boom,
Finally.
Good job, boys.
Finally. The funniest part is, and this is every time I've fired a car with a Holly, the only time it hasn't fired off first try is if I've done something wrong.
Dude, you know it's the first start up when you see the smoke?
Yeah, you smell it.
Smoke
You smell
coming
all
off the headers, all the
stuff burning.
Cheers.
Guys, sorry, one more time, make sure idle's okay. Just one more time. I just want to make sure we're good here.
Well, I mean, you gotta fine tune there.
Probably just needs this. We'll have to settle that once we get the throttle cable situation actually fixed. So you gotta fill it while it's running.
To what level?
Just right above the green.
Alrighty, well, we got this thing kind of pushed out of the way. I've got to put a car on the lift tomorrow to knock out a couple quick little projects while we wait for a couple parts on this. We need a new throttle cable. That's one thing. It's always been annoying. It's never been quite right, but the housing keeps popping out of basically the collar here, and it's just annoying. So our throttle cable situation is not great, which is why we didn't even bother trying to set up the idle, because it's barely a functioning throttle cable. The other thing, the coil pack harnesses, since this side, it just doesn't really reach, which is why they ended up getting flipped, which is our only problem. So I have some extension harnesses to bring the connector out here. That'll make servicing significantly easier too. But yeah, I mean, it literally fired up essentially first try as soon as everything was connected correctly. And I'm pretty happy because I was nervous. I knew if it didn't start, I would start questioning the bulkhead connector. And we started pinning everything out and checking and ohming things out. And it was all going according to plan until we noticed that the coil packs were backwards. You know, the two was 1 and 1 was 2. So once we fixed that, fired right up. That Matt Happel Stock Mechanics bass tune, A1. They're always so solid. Like, as long as I have my end of things correct, it usually fires up first try on a Matt Happel bass tune. So I'm sure I could jibber jabber on and on, but I'm gonna end it here. Go get a good night's rest. We had a late night last night. It's a late night tonight, but we got it done. She fired up. Very, very rewarding. How do you guys feel?
Feeling good.
It's a long project. There's more to do, but I mean, this is, you know, the rest of the stuff is just essentially buttoning it up, getting the brakes on, getting the brake lines tossed in, putting the body panels on, which all the front just goes on. The back we got to make a couple mounts for, but we are close. So I'm gonna quit jibber jabbering. I'm gonna let you guys go. Thanks for watching. Thanks for subscribing. Goodbye.